The winter of 1932 descended upon the Blue Ridge Mountains like a cold, unforgiving hand. By late November, the isolated valleys of southwestern Virginia had become worlds unto themselves, cut off from civilization by walls of fog and ice. The narrow dirt roads connecting the scattered homesteads transformed into treacherous paths that few dared to travel. The Great Depression had already hollowed out these mountain communities, but this winter brought something darker than poverty. In the deepest hollow of McDowell County, where the pine trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the forest floor even at noon, stood a property that locals had learned to avoid. The land belonged to a family known only as the Harpers, though some of the older residents whispered that this wasn't their real name, that they'd arrived from somewhere else years ago, carrying secrets as heavy as the trunks they'd unloaded from their wagon. The property itself sprawled across 40 acres of dense woodland, accessible only by a single overgrown path that wound through the trees like a scar. A crude fence made of split rails marked the boundary, though it seemed designed less to keep animals in and more to keep people out. Hand-painted signs nailed to trees warned trespassers away in letters that had faded to the color of dried blood. At the center of this isolated domain sat a farmhouse built from dark timber, its windows perpetually shuttered, its chimney releasing thin streams of smoke that dissipated quickly into the gray sky. Behind the main structure stood a barn that leaned slightly to one side, as if the building itself wanted to escape. Between them, a well with no protective wall rose from the frozen ground, its stones stained black with age and moisture. The head of the household was Ezekiel Harper, a man who appeared to be in his late 50s, though his weathered face and stooped posture suggested a harder life than his years should have produced. He stood just over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that remained broad despite the hunger that had thinned most men in these mountains. His eyes were pale gray, the color of winter ice, and they possessed a quality that made people look away quickly. He wore the same dark wool coat every day, its fabric worn smooth at the elbows, and he walked with a measured deliberation that suggested every movement was calculated. Ezekiel rarely came to town. When he did, it was always alone, arriving at the general store just before closing time. He would place his orders in a low voice, pay with coins he counted out slowly, and leave without engaging in the idle conversation that was the lifeblood of these mountain communities. The storekeeper, a man named Thomas Whitley who had run the establishment for 30 years, noted that Ezekiel never looked at people directly when speaking to them, always focusing on a point just past their shoulder. But it was Ezekiel's family that generated the whispers. There were 6 of them living on that property, according to the census taker who had made the treacherous journey in 1930. Ezekiel and his wife Martha, a silent woman with dark hair going gray and a face that seemed frozen in an expression of permanent resignation. Then there were the children, though by 1932 they were children no longer. 2 sons, Jacob, age 24, and Samuel, age 22. Both were tall like their father, with the same pale eyes and dark hair. They were rarely seen apart, moving through the woods like shadows when they occasionally appeared on the edges of town to haul supplies. Neither spoke unless absolutely necessary, and when they did, their voices carried the flat affect of men who had learned that words were dangerous. 2 daughters, Rebecca, age 21, and Sarah, age 19. Unlike their brothers, the young women were almost never seen. The last confirmed sighting had been at a church service 3 years prior, where they had sat in the back pew, dressed in identical gray dresses that hung loosely on their thin frames, their hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the skin of their faces. They had left before the service ended, following their father out into the rain without a word. The community had developed theories, as isolated communities always do. Some believed Ezekiel was simply a recluse, a man broken by the war or by losses no one knew about, who wanted only to be left alone with his family. Others suggested he was hiding from something, that the family had fled some scandal or crime in whatever place they'd come from. The oldest residents remembered when the Harpers had first arrived 15 years earlier, how Ezekiel had paid cash for the property, and immediately set about building the fence, as if establishing a border between his world and everyone else's. But it was in the winter of 1932 that the whispers began to take on a darker tone. It started with Anna Mitchell, the midwife who served the scattered homesteads throughout the county. She had been called to a difficult birth on a farm 5 miles from the Harper property in early December. The journey back took her past the entrance to their land, just as night was falling. She later told her husband that she had heard sounds coming from the direction of the Harper house, sounds that didn't fit with anything she knew of farm life. It was crying, she said, sitting at her kitchen table with shaking hands wrapped around a cup of tea. But not the kind of crying you hear when someone's sad or hurt. It was the kind of crying that comes when someone's given up on being heard. Her husband had dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps a wounded animal, but Anna insisted she knew the difference. She had heard too many sounds of suffering in her years as a midwife to mistake it for anything else. 2 weeks later, a hunter named Douglas Grant reported seeing someone in the woods near the Harper boundary. It was early morning, the fog still thick between the trees, and at first he thought it was a deer. But as he moved closer, he realized it was a person, a young woman, standing completely still among the pines. She wore a thin dress despite the December cold, and her feet were bare on the frozen ground. Douglas called out to her, concerned she might be lost or in trouble. The figure turned toward him, and he caught a glimpse of a pale face framed by dark hair before she fled deeper into the Harper property, moving with surprising speed through the dense undergrowth. When Douglas mentioned the encounter at the general store, describing what he'd seen, Thomas Whitley went quiet. After a long pause, he said, "That would be one of the Harper girls. Best you pretend you didn't see anything." But Douglas pressed for an explanation. "She looked terrified," he insisted. "And she wasn't dressed for the weather. Something's not right up there." The conversation died quickly, as conversations about the Harpers always did. But the seed of unease had been planted, and it began to grow. On December 23rd, Ezekiel made one of his rare trips to town. It was late afternoon, the sky already darkening with the early winter sunset, when he arrived at the general store. Thomas Whitley noted that Ezekiel seemed different that day, more agitated than usual. His hands trembled slightly as he counted out coins, and he kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to follow him inside. The order itself was unusual. In addition to the standard supplies of flour, salt, and coffee, Ezekiel requested several items that made Thomas pause: a large quantity of rope, 3 heavy padlocks, and a dozen candles. When Thomas remarked on the candles, Ezekiel's response was terse. "The darkness comes early this time of year." As Ezekiel loaded his purchases into his wagon, he turned back to Thomas with an expression that might have been fear or might have been warning. "People should mind their own affairs," he said quietly, "especially when it comes to matters of family. A man has the right to conduct his household as he sees fit." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He watched as Ezekiel drove away, the wagon disappearing into the gathering darkness. Later, he would tell the sheriff that Ezekiel's words had sounded less like advice and more like a threat. Christmas came and went. The Harper property remained dark and silent, no smoke rising from the chimney despite the bitter cold. New Year's Day arrived with a fresh snowfall that blanketed the valley, covering the paths and roads with a pristine white layer that showed every track and movement. It was on January 3rd, 1933, when everything changed. A mailman making his rounds noticed that the mail for the Harper family, which Ezekiel typically collected from the post office himself, had been accumulating for over a week. Concerned, and perhaps emboldened by daylight and the company of another traveler, he convinced the local deputy to accompany him to the property to check on the family's welfare. They found the gate unlocked, the first time anyone could remember seeing it that way. The path to the house showed no recent tracks in the snow. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the crunch of their boots. What they discovered when they reached the farmhouse would launch an investigation that would shake the foundations of the community and reveal secrets that some believed should have remained buried forever. But that discovery, and the horrifying truth it unveiled, would have to wait. Because as the deputy raised his hand to knock on the Harper's door, both men heard something that made their blood run cold. From somewhere inside the dark house came the sound of a child crying, and then, cutting through the silence like a knife, a man's voice raised in anger, shouting words they couldn't quite make out. The deputy's hand froze inches from the door. The mailman took a step backward. And in that moment, both men realized they were standing at the threshold of something far worse than they had imagined. The door remained closed. The shouting stopped as suddenly as it had started. And in the terrible silence that followed, the two men faced a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Knock on that door and confront whatever lay beyond it, or turn around and leave, pretending they had heard nothing, seen nothing, suspected nothing. Behind that door, in the darkness of the Harper house, a family's terrible secret waited to be discovered. But that revelation would have to wait for another day, another chapter, another step deeper into the hollow where the light never quite reached, and where the truth was more disturbing than any rumor could capture. Deputy Robert Mason's hand remained suspended in the cold January air, trembling slightly as the echo of the shouting faded into an oppressive silence. Beside him, the mailman, Charles Bennett, had gone pale, his breath forming rapid clouds in the freezing morning air. The two men exchanged a glance that communicated more than words ever could. They had stumbled into something that would change them forever. Robert was 32 years old, a veteran of the Great War who had seen things in the trenches of France that still visited him in nightmares. He had returned to McDowell County believing he had left horror behind, that the quiet mountains would offer him peace. Now, standing before this dark house with its shuttered windows and unnatural silence, he felt that same crawling sensation he'd experienced before going over the top into no man's land, the certainty that death and suffering waited just ahead. He was a tall man, lean from the Depression years, with a face weathered beyond his years and eyes that had learned to see past what people wanted to show. He wore his deputy's badge pinned to a wool coat that had belonged to his father, and he carried a revolver at his hip that he'd fired exactly 3 times in his 5 years of service, all of them at rattlesnakes. "Deputy," Charles whispered, his voice barely audible. "Maybe we should get the sheriff." "Maybe we should—" Robert raised his other hand to silence him. He had heard something else now, something that made his decision for him. It was the sound of whimpering, quiet and desperate, like an animal caught in a trap. But it wasn't an animal. It was human, and it was coming from inside the house. He knocked. 3 solid raps that echoed in the stillness. The response was immediate and startling. The whimpering stopped. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approached the door from inside. The men could hear the sound of locks being thrown, not just one but several, each metallic click seeming to seal something away, or perhaps release it. When the door finally opened, it did so only a few inches, held by a chain. Through the gap, Ezekiel Harper's pale gray eyes stared out at them with an expression that combined fury and something else. Was it fear? "What do you want?" His voice was low, controlled, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of barely contained rage. Robert cleared his throat, forcing himself to maintain eye contact, despite the intensity of Ezekiel's stare. "Mr. Harper, we're conducting a welfare check. Your mail has been piling up, and with the weather being what it is, we wanted to make sure everything was all right with you and your family." "We're fine. Leave us alone." Ezekiel began to close the door. Robert put his boot against the frame. "Sir, we heard shouting and crying. I'm going to need to see that everyone in this household is safe and well." For a long moment, neither man moved. The tension stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, came a sound that made Robert's blood run cold. A woman's voice, weak and pleading. "Please, help us." The words were cut off abruptly, followed by a thud and silence. Robert's hand moved to his revolver. "Mr. Harper, I'm going to need you to open this door. Now." What happened next occurred in a blur of motion that Robert would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. Ezekiel's eyes widened, not with fear, but with a kind of desperate resignation, and he suddenly threw open the door, not to invite them in, but to rush out. He was larger than he'd appeared through the gap, and he hit Robert with enough force to send both men tumbling backward off the porch and into the snow. Charles shouted something, but his words were lost in the chaos. Robert struggled beneath Ezekiel's weight, the older man's hands clawing at his face, his coat, trying to reach the revolver. They rolled in the snow, Robert's training from the war suddenly flooding back, teaching his body how to fight, how to survive. A gunshot split the air. For a horrible moment, Robert thought he'd been shot. Then he realized the sound had come from inside the house. Both men froze, still tangled together in the snow, and looked up to see one of the sons, Jacob or Samuel, Robert couldn't tell which, standing in the doorway with a hunting rifle raised toward the sky. The young man's face was expressionless, carved from stone. "Father," the young man said, his voice flat and mechanical. "Stop. It's over." Ezekiel's body went limp. Robert pushed him away and scrambled to his feet, drawing his revolver and pointing it at the figure in the doorway. Charles had retreated to the wagon, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the reins. "Put the rifle down," Robert commanded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Put it down now, and step away from the door." The young man, Robert could now see it was Jacob, the older son, looked at the rifle in his hands as if surprised to find it there. Then, with the same mechanical precision, he leaned it against the doorframe and stepped back into the shadows of the house. "You should come inside," Jacob said, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "You should see what he's done. What we've all done." Robert kept his weapon trained on Ezekiel as he slowly approached the door. The older man had collapsed in the snow, his face buried in his hands, his body shaking with what might have been sobs or laughter. It was impossible to tell. The interior of the Harper house was darker than Robert had expected. Heavy curtains covered every window, and the only light came from a few candles burning on a rough wooden table. The smell hit him immediately: unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and something else, something medicinal and wrong that made his stomach turn. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he began to make out the details of the room. It was sparsely furnished. The table, a few chairs, a cold fireplace. But it was the people that captured his attention and filled him with a horror that transcended anything he'd witnessed in the war. Martha Harper sat in a chair by the dead fireplace, rocking slowly back and forth. Her hair hung loose around her face, gray and tangled, and her eyes stared at nothing. She was humming something tunelessly under her breath, the same 4 notes over and over again. Samuel, the younger son, stood against the far wall, his arms wrapped around himself. He was thinner than his brother, his face gaunt and pale, and he watched Robert with eyes that seemed to hold no hope whatsoever. But it was the young women who made Robert's hand tighten on his revolver. Rebecca and Sarah sat together on a crude wooden bench, their hands clasped between them. They wore identical gray dresses, stained and torn, and their hair had been cut short, unevenly, as if with dull scissors or a knife. Their faces were too thin, their skin too pale, and their eyes held the kind of emptiness that comes from having every hope extinguished. And there, in Rebecca's arms, was a baby, an infant that couldn't have been more than a few months old, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, its tiny fist curled against its mouth. Robert felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He had been a deputy long enough to recognize the signs of abuse, of neglect, of households where darkness had taken root. But this was something beyond his experience, beyond his understanding. "Jacob," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the scene before him, "where did that baby come from?" Jacob laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Where do you think babies come from, deputy?" They come from mothers, and that one's mother is sitting right there. Rebecca, my sister, my wife. The words hung in the air like poison. Robert's mind struggled to process what he'd just heard. Your... what? My wife, Jacob repeated, each word carefully enunciated. Just like Sarah is Samuel's wife. That's how Father wanted it. That's how he made it. He said we couldn't trust outsiders, couldn't bring shame to the family by marrying people from town. He said we had to keep the bloodline pure, keep the family together. So he married us. Rebecca to me, Sarah to Samuel. He performed the ceremonies himself, right here in this room, with Mother watching and God himself as witness. Or at least that's what he told us. Robert felt bile rise in his throat. He had heard rumors of isolated families in the deep mountains, of communities that had turned inward, of practices that violated every law of God and man. But he had dismissed them as stories, as exaggerations. Now he stood in the middle of one, and the reality was worse than any rumor could capture. When? He managed to ask. When did this happen? 3 years ago, Samuel spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca and Jacob first, then Sarah and me 6 months later. Father said it was time we took on the responsibilities of marriage. He said the outside world was corrupt and evil, that the only people we could trust were family. He said, Samuel's voice broke. He said it was what God wanted. Rebecca had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her face as she clutched the baby closer. Sarah reached over and took her hand, and Robert saw that both young women wore crude rings made of twisted wire around their fingers. There's more, Jacob said, and his voice carried a terrible finality. Deputy, there's more you need to see, in the barn. That's where he kept us when we tried to refuse. That's where he took us when we needed to be corrected. Robert didn't want to know. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to walk out of this house, to ride back to town, to hand this horror over to someone else. But he knew he couldn't. He had sworn an oath to protect and serve, and these people, these children, because that's what they still were despite their ages, needed protection more than anyone he'd ever encountered. Charles, he called out, his voice surprisingly steady. Go back to town, get Sheriff Morrison, get Dr. Hayes, and bring help. We're going to need witnesses. He heard the wagon pull away, the sound of wheels crunching through snow gradually fading into the distance. Then he turned back to the family, to this group of damaged souls trapped in a nightmare of one man's making. I need all of you to tell me everything, Robert said quietly. Everything that's happened here. And I need to see what's in that barn. You won't believe us, Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse as if from disuse or screaming. Nobody will believe us. Who would believe that a father could do these things to his own children? Robert holstered his revolver and pulled a chair closer, sitting down so that he was at eye level with the young women. I believe you, he said simply. And I promise you, I will make sure everyone knows what happened here. Your father will answer for what he's done. Outside, Ezekiel remained in the snow where he'd fallen, no longer struggling, no longer shouting. He lay still and silent, as if he had already accepted his fate, as if he had always known this day would come. The morning sun had fully risen now, its light streaming through the bare branches of the surrounding trees. But inside the Harper house, darkness still reigned, and the true depth of its horror had only begun to reveal itself. Jacob walked to a cabinet and withdrew a worn leather journal. He wrote it all down, he said, handing the book to Robert. Every decision, every justification, every prayer he said before he hurt us. He said he was keeping a record for future generations, to show them how to keep a family pure and godly. Read it, deputy. Read what kind of monster we've been living with. Robert took the journal with trembling hands. The leather was worn smooth, and the pages were filled with neat, careful handwriting. He opened it to a random page and began to read. December 15th, 1929. The corruption of the modern world grows worse each day. I have decided that my children must not be exposed to the sinful influences of outsiders. The bloodline must remain pure. I have begun preparations for the sacred unions that will preserve our family. He closed the book, unable to read further. His hands were shaking now, not from cold but from rage and disgust so powerful he could barely contain it. "How many people know about this?" he asked. "Has anyone tried to help you?" "We tried to tell someone once," Rebecca whispered, adjusting the baby in her arms. 2 years ago, Sarah managed to get into town while Father was sleeping. She went to the church, tried to tell the pastor. But Father had been giving money to the church, helping them during the Depression. The pastor didn't believe her. He said she was confused, that she was disrespecting her father. He brought her back here himself and told Father what she'd said. "What happened then?" Robert asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Sarah rolled up her sleeve, revealing scars that crisscrossed her forearm like a map of suffering. "He said he had to drive the demons out of me. He said I had been possessed by evil spirits that made me lie about him. He locked me in the barn for 3 days with no food or water. Jacob and Samuel tried to bring me things, but he caught them and—" She paused, her voice breaking. "He hurt them too." The sound of horses and wagons approaching broke the terrible silence. Sheriff Morrison had arrived, along with Dr. Hayes and 3 other deputies. Robert stood and walked to the door, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Sheriff," he said as the older man approached, "you're going to want to arrest Ezekiel Harper. And you're going to want to prepare yourself for what we've found here. It's worse than anything we imagined." Sheriff Morrison, a grizzled man in his 60s, who had seen his share of mountain tragedies, looked at Robert's face and understood immediately that this was different. "How bad?" "Bad enough that it'll make the papers across the country," Robert replied. "Bad enough that people will be talking about this for generations. This isn't just a crime, Sheriff. This is evil." As the law enforcement officials entered the house and began their investigation, as Dr. Hayes started examining the family members and documenting their injuries, as Ezekiel Harper was hauled to his feet and placed in irons, the full scope of the horror began to emerge. But there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered, still depths of darkness that hadn't yet been plumbed. The barn remained locked, its contents unknown. And in that leather journal, in Ezekiel's careful handwriting, lay a philosophy of control and corruption that would shock even the most hardened investigators. The story of the Harper family was only beginning to unfold, and the worst revelations were still to come. The barn stood like a dark monument at the edge of the property, its shadow stretching across the snow-covered ground as the winter sun climbed higher in the sky. Deputy Robert Mason stared at its weathered doors, feeling a dread so profound it seemed to have physical weight. Behind him, Sheriff Morrison was organizing the scene, directing his men to secure Ezekiel Harper in the wagon and to begin taking statements from the family members. Dr. Hayes emerged from the house, his medical bag in hand and his face ashen. He was a man in his late 50s who had practiced medicine in these mountains for over 30 years, who had delivered babies in cabins lit only by firelight and had closed the eyes of men who died from nothing more than infected cuts. But what he'd just witnessed inside the Harper house had shaken him to his core. "Robert," he said quietly, pulling the deputy aside, "those young people, the physical evidence of long-term mistreatment is extensive. Malnutrition, healed fractures that were never properly set, scars consistent with beatings and restraints, and the psychological trauma." He paused, removing his spectacles to clean them with a trembling hand. "I've never seen anything like it. They've been living in a prison, and their father was the warden and executioner combined." "What about the baby?" Robert asked. Dr. Hayes's expression darkened further. "Healthy, miraculously, about 4 months old. But Rebecca—" He lowered his voice even more. "She's barely 21 years old, and her body shows signs of having been through considerable stress during the pregnancy. She had no medical care, no proper nutrition. That she and the child survived is nothing short of miraculous. Will they recover? The family, I mean. Can they come back from this? The doctor was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. The body can heal, given time and proper care. But the mind... What that man did to his children goes beyond physical harm. He broke something fundamental in them, made them doubt their own worth, their own reality. That kind of damage doesn't heal easily, if it heals at all. Sheriff Morrison approached, his weathered face grave. Robert, the family is saying there's more we need to see. In the barn. Jacob says that's where Ezekiel kept his correction chamber. Whatever that means, I don't think I want to know. But we have to document everything for the trial. Robert nodded, though every fiber of his being wanted to refuse. I'll do it. I'm coming with you, Morrison said. And we're bringing 2 more deputies as witnesses. This needs to be done by the book. When this goes to trial, and it will go to trial, I want no question about the evidence we collected. 4 men approached the barn, Robert, Sheriff Morrison, and deputies Thomas Crane and William Foster, both young men who had joined the force within the last year. None of them spoke as they walked through the snow, their boots leaving deep prints that would remain frozen there for days. The barn doors were secured with 3 separate padlocks, the same ones Ezekiel had purchased from the general store just weeks earlier. Robert produced the keys they'd found on Ezekiel's person, his hands steady, despite the fear coursing through him. Each lock opened with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. The doors swung open, and the smell that emerged made all 4 men step back instinctively. It was the stench of human waste, of fear and suffering, of a place where terrible things had happened repeatedly. Robert pulled a handkerchief over his nose and mouth and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the light filtering through gaps in the wooden walls. As his eyes adjusted, he began to make out the details of the space, and each discovery was worse than the last. The main area of the barn had been divided into sections. One held the expected farm equipment, rusted tools, a broken wagon wheel, moldy hay bales. But the other section, separated by a crude wall of wooden planks, had been converted into something else entirely. There were chains bolted to the support beams, some still bearing dark stains that Robert recognized as blood. A wooden post stood in the center of the space, worn smooth in places where rope had been tied and retied countless times. The floor was stained and warped, and in one corner sat a bucket that had clearly been used as a latrine. But it was the walls that told the story most clearly. Scratched into the wooden planks, sometimes in letters so small they were barely visible, sometimes carved deep enough to splinter the wood, were words. Hundreds of words, thousands maybe, covering every surface within reach. They were messages, prayers, and pleas etched by desperate hands over the course of years. Please, God, help us. Father, forgive us. We didn't mean to disobey. Sarah is sick, she needs a doctor, please. Day 127, I think, or maybe more, I can't remember. If anyone finds this, we are prisoners here. Jacob and Samuel, protect us when you can. I don't want to be a wife, I just want to be a daughter. Robert felt tears streaming down his face as he read the messages, each one a testament to suffering that should never have occurred. Behind him, he heard one of the younger deputies vomit. Sheriff Morrison's voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. Document everything. Every chain, every stain, every word on these walls. I want photographs. I want measurements. I want this entire structure preserved as evidence. They found more as they searched. A box containing a whip made from leather straps, several lengths of rope, and a leather strap designed to gag someone. In a corner, hidden beneath moldy straw, they discovered a second journal. This one smaller than the first and written in a different hand. Rebecca's, they would later learn. Robert opened it carefully, his hands shaking. The entries were dated sporadically, written in pencil that had faded in places but was still mostly legible. September 3rd, 1930. Father says I am to marry Jacob next week. I told him I didn't want to, that Jacob is my brother. He locked me in the barn for 2 days. Jacob brought me water when Father was sleeping. He cried and said he was sorry, that he didn't want this either, but Father would hurt us worse if we refused. November 17th, 1930. I am with child. Father says it is God's blessing on our union. I am terrified. Mother won't look at me anymore. She just rocks in her chair and hums. I think something broke inside her a long time ago. March 4th, 1931. Sarah tried to run away last night. She made it almost 2 miles before Father found her. What he did to her in the barn. I can hear her screaming even now. Jacob wanted to stop him, but Samuel held him back. Samuel said if we interfered, it would only be worse for Sarah. I hate that he's right. I hate everything about this. Robert closed the journal, unable to read further. The scope of the suffering, the years of systematic abuse and control, the way Ezekiel had twisted the concepts of family and faith into tools of torment, it was almost incomprehensible. "Sheriff," he said, his voice rough, "we need to get this family away from here. They need real help, medical care, somewhere safe where they can begin to heal." "Already arranged," Morrison replied. "I've sent word to the county seat. They're preparing rooms at the hospital there. The church ladies are gathering clothes and supplies, and I've contacted a lawyer friend of mine who specializes in difficult cases. He's already on his way." They spent another hour documenting the barn, though every minute felt like an eternity. When they finally emerged back into the daylight, all 4 men stood silent for a moment, breathing in the clean mountain air as if it could wash away what they'd witnessed. Back at the house, the scene had changed. Martha Harper had been coaxed out of her chair and was sitting in one of the wagons, wrapped in blankets and still humming her tuneless melody. The 4 young people had been separated, each being interviewed individually by different deputies. Ezekiel remained in irons, seated in another wagon with 2 armed deputies guarding him. It was Jacob who approached Robert as the deputy returned from the barn. The young man's face was gaunt, but his eyes held something that hadn't been there before. Perhaps it was hope, or perhaps just the absence of constant fear. "Deputy Mason," he said formally, "I need to tell you something. Something Father made us promise never to reveal." Robert waited, though he wasn't sure he could handle any more revelations today. "There were others," Jacob continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before us. Father had another family back in Kentucky. That's where we came from, though I was too young to remember much. He had a wife there and children. But something happened. I don't know what exactly. Mother once told me that his first wife had tried to leave him, tried to take the children. Father said she died in an accident, but Mother, when she thought I wasn't listening, she said other things, darker things. Are you saying your father might have—" Robert couldn't finish the sentence. "I'm saying that what he did to us, the way he thought about family and control and purity, this wasn't the first time. I think he's done this before. And I think we need to find out what happened to his first family, because if they're still alive somewhere, they need to be found. And if they're not—" Jacob's voice broke. "If they're not, then someone needs to know what happened to them." The implications sent a chill through Robert that had nothing to do with the winter cold. If Jacob was right, then Ezekiel Harper wasn't just a man who had abused his family. He was potentially something much worse. Sheriff Morrison had overheard the conversation. His face was grim as he approached. "We'll send telegrams to Kentucky, to every county sheriff and marshal we can reach. If there's a record of Ezekiel Harper there, if there's any trace of what happened to his first family, we'll find it." As the afternoon wore on, the property became a hub of activity. More officials arrived from neighboring counties, drawn by word of the shocking discovery. Reporters from the regional newspapers appeared, their cameras flashing as they photographed the house, the barn, and eventually Ezekiel himself, who stared at them with an expression that combined defiance and resignation. It was Dr. Hayes who made the final devastating discovery of the day. While conducting a thorough examination of the property's grounds, he noticed a disturbed area of earth behind the barn, a rectangular section where the snow had settled differently than the surrounding area. "Sheriff," he called out, his voice carrying across the property, "you need to see this." 3 deputies began to dig carefully, and within minutes they had uncovered something that confirmed everyone's worst fears. A small wooden box, roughly the size of a shoebox, buried about 2 feet deep in the frozen earth. Inside the box, wrapped in deteriorating cloth, were the remains of an infant. The size suggested the child had been newborn or close to it. There was no way to determine how long it had been buried, but the implications were clear and horrifying. Rebecca, watching from the wagon where she sat with her baby, let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. Sarah moved to her side, wrapping her arms around her sister, and both young women wept. It was Samuel who provided the explanation, his voice flat and emotionless, as if he had gone beyond the capacity to feel anymore. That was Rebecca's first child, born 2 years ago. It didn't survive the birth. Father said it was because she wasn't faithful enough, wasn't pure enough. He said God had taken the child as punishment. He buried it himself and made us all watch. He said it was a lesson about the consequences of sin. But Dr. Hayes's examination of the tiny remains suggested a different story. The child hadn't died from natural causes or complications of birth. The evidence suggested it had been denied care, possibly even deliberately harmed. Whether it had been born alive and allowed to die, or whether something more actively terrible had occurred, would never be fully known. But the discovery added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible situation. As the sun began to set on January 3, 1933, the Harper property had been transformed. What had been a place of hidden suffering was now exposed to the light, its secrets laid bare for the world to see. Ezekiel Harper sat in chains, soon to be transported to the county jail where he would await trial. His family, freed from his control but shattered by years of abuse, prepared to leave the only home they had known, heading toward an uncertain future. Robert Mason stood at the edge of the property, watching as the wagons began to depart. He had been a deputy for 5 years, had dealt with drunken fights and property disputes and the occasional theft. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this, for the depth of human cruelty he had witnessed within this seemingly ordinary family. Sheriff Morrison joined him, both men silent for a long moment. Finally, the older man spoke. "The newspapers are going to make this into a sensation. The trial will be covered across the country. People will want to understand how something like this could happen, how a father could do these things to his own children." "Will they ever understand?" Robert asked. "Can anyone who hasn't seen this place, who hasn't read those journals or seen those chains or heard those young people's voices when they talk about what was done to them, can they really understand?" "No," Morrison said simply. "They'll try. They'll read the reports and look at the photographs and listen to the testimony, but they won't truly understand. How could they? This kind of evil is beyond normal human comprehension." The trial of Ezekiel Harper would indeed become a sensation, drawing attention from across the nation. The details that emerged during the proceedings would shock even the most hardened observers. The journals, the physical evidence from the barn, the testimony of the children, all of it painted a picture of systematic abuse and control that seemed impossible to believe, yet was undeniably true. Ezekiel would be convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. He would die in prison 7 years later, never showing remorse for his actions, maintaining until the end that he had been trying to preserve his family's purity and following God's will. The Harper children would spend years trying to rebuild their lives. Rebecca and Sarah would eventually move to different states, seeking anonymity and a chance to heal away from the shadow of their past. Jacob and Samuel would struggle with guilt and trauma, both eventually taking their own lives within a decade of their father's conviction. Martha Harper would spend the rest of her days in a psychiatric facility, never fully recovering from the years of control and complicity, her mind broken beyond repair. The baby, Rebecca's child, would be adopted by a childless couple from another county who promised to raise the child with love and never tell them about the circumstances of their birth. Whether that promise was kept, history does not record. The property itself would stand abandoned for years before being sold at auction. The new owners would tear down both the house and the barn, unable to live with the knowledge of what had occurred there. Even the land itself seemed cursed, unable to produce good crops or provide peace to anyone who tried to settle there. Deputy Robert Mason would carry the memory of that January day for the rest of his life. He would continue serving as a law enforcement officer for another 20 years, eventually becoming sheriff himself. But he would never forget the Harper family, never stop seeing the words scratched into those barn walls, never stop hearing the quiet desperation in those young people's voices when they described what had been done to them. In the decades that followed, the case of the Harper family would become a dark legend in McDowell County and beyond. It would be studied by psychologists and criminologists, held up as an example of the worst extremes of parental abuse and control. The journals would be preserved as evidence of how twisted ideology and isolation could create conditions for unimaginable suffering. But for those who had witnessed it firsthand, for the deputies and doctors and neighbors who had seen the aftermath of Ezekiel Harper's reign of terror, no amount of academic study or criminal justice reform could erase the fundamental question that haunted them all. How does a human being become a monster? And how many other monsters might be hiding in plain sight, their victims suffering in silence behind closed doors and isolated properties, waiting for someone to hear their cries for help? The Harper case would lead to reforms in how isolated families were monitored, how reports of abuse were investigated, and how seriously authorities took complaints from young people about conditions in their homes. But it came too late for Rebecca, Sarah, Jacob, and Samuel, 4 children who had lost their childhoods, their innocence, and ultimately their futures to one man's twisted vision of family and purity. As Robert Mason stood on that property for the last time before it was torn down, he placed his hand on one of the barn's walls, feeling the scratches and grooves where desperate fingers had carved out messages of pain and hope. He made a silent promise to those who had suffered here. Their story would not be forgotten. The truth of what had happened in this isolated hollow would be remembered, preserved, and told, so that perhaps, somewhere, someone else's suffering might be prevented. The sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow. The property fell silent once more. But the echoes of what had occurred there would reverberate through history, a dark reminder of the depths to which human cruelty can sink, and the resilience of those who somehow survive it. The End, based on research into historical cases of familial abuse and isolation in rural America during the Depression era. While this specific narrative is fictionalized, it reflects documented patterns of control, abuse, and exploitation that occurred in isolated communities throughout American history.